In the autumn of 1889, people across Montana's Bitterroot Valley began noticing something about the Holloway Ranch that they could not explain. Every evening, just as the last light drained from the western ridges, widow Susan Holloway walked out to her back fence carrying a covered tin pail. She would empty it onto the frozen ground where her pasture met the tree line. Bones, gristle, the trimmings from whatever meat she had cured that week, a handful of tallow scraps if she had them. Then she stood at the fence for a moment, looking up toward the ridge, before turning back to the cabin without a word. At first, people assumed it was a habit born of loneliness. Grief did strange things to a woman living alone. Some widows kept a chair pulled up to an empty table. Some talked to their livestock. Feeding scraps to the timber seemed at worst harmless, but as the weeks passed, the pail kept coming. Rain or clear sky, warm evening or bitter one, the offering appeared at the fence line at the same hour. Her 13-year-old nephew, Micah, who had come to live with her the year before, carried the smaller pail sometimes when his aunt's back was troubling her. And when a young cowhand from the Bar D was riding fence one November afternoon, he saw something that changed the tone of the conversation entirely. 3 wolves stood at the timber's edge, watching him back. Not skulking, not fleeing, just watching. As though they belonged there, as though they were waiting. The word waiting moved through the valley the way a spark moves through dry grass. Within a week, everyone from the sawmill to the mercantile had an opinion. Some folks called it grief madness. Sheriff Cutler used gentler language when he spoke of it, but even he shook his head. Susan's husband, Daniel, had died in a blizzard nearly 6 years back, and something in her, people said, had gone with him. Widow's fancy, the churchwomen called it, a softening of the mind that showed itself in odd places. The ranchers took a harder view. Elias Boyd, who ran the largest herd in the valley and had lost 2 calves that fall to what he called predation, brought the matter up at the feed store one afternoon and did not lower his voice. "She's feeding them," he said. "She's feeding them right into our pastures." The men around him nodded slowly. Ike Wembley, a trapper who had worked the Bitterroots for 20 years, offered to run a line through the ridge behind her property free of charge. Susan turned him away at the porch step, politely but firmly. She did the same when 2 other trappers came separately over the following month. She would not permit steel jaw traps on the ridge. She would not permit poison. She would not permit a hunt. By the end of November, the nickname had settled. The Wolf Widow. It moved from lip to lip without malice at first, the way small town names do. And then it began to carry weight. Every calf lost, every ewe missing, every torn hide found in the drifts, the pack was named for it. Her pack. And her pack was fed. That, in the ranchers' minds, made the equation simple. She was giving away what belonged to no one so that they might take what belonged to everyone. Susan heard the name. She heard the accusations too. She never argued, never explained, never once raised her voice to defend herself. Micah watched her at the window some evenings, and he wondered whether she was even listening to the valley anymore or whether she had gone somewhere else entirely. What no one in the Bitterroot yet understood was that the widow was not paying tribute to madness. She was paying a debt. December arrived in the Bitterroot with a wind that came straight off the divide and did not soften as it crossed the valley. The pasture grass turned brittle. The creek behind the Holloway place froze along its edges by the first week, and by the second week it froze clean across. Susan added a scoop of coarse cornmeal to the evening pail now, sometimes a few ends of hard cheese that had gone past their use, whatever she could spare without cutting into the winter stores. Micah watched her measure it out at the kitchen table one night, and he asked the question he had been carrying since October. "Aunt Susan, why do we do it?" She did not look up from the pail. Her hands kept working, careful and deliberate, the way she did everything now. For a long moment, the only sound in the cabin was the tick of the wood stove settling and the wind pressing against the north wall. Then she set the pail down and looked at him with an expression he could not read. "Because we owe it," she said. "That's all you need to know for now." He wanted to ask what she owed and to whom, but something in her voice closed the door on further questions. He carried the pail out for her that night. The scraps hit the frozen ground with a hollow sound. When he looked up toward the ridge, he thought he saw movement between two lodgepole pines, low and gray and quick. But by the time his eyes fixed on the place, whatever had been there was gone. Around them, the valley was tightening. Word came down from the northern camps that the winter would be a hard one. Old Tobias Kane, who had trapped these mountains longer than most men had been alive, sat by the stove at the trading post and told anyone who would listen that the elk were already low. The Canada geese had passed south 3 weeks ahead of their usual time. The mule deer were bedding in the willow bottoms instead of the high timber. When Tobias spoke of animals, people generally listened, and what he said sank into the room the way cold water sinks into wool. None of that changed Elias Boyd's mind about the widow. If anything, the coming hardness of the season sharpened his grievance. A rancher facing a bad winter had no room for a neighbor who fed his losses. He rode out to the Holloway place one gray afternoon with 2 of his hands and dismounted at her gate without asking leave. Susan met him on the porch. Micah stood behind the doorframe, listening. "Mrs. Holloway, I mean no disrespect," Boyd said, though the sharpness of his tone said otherwise. "But I've lost 4 head between the fall roundup and today. Ike Wembley says he can clean that ridge in a week. I'm asking you, plain, to let him." Susan looked past him toward the timber. Her hands were folded in front of her apron. "No, Mr. Boyd." "You've got reasons?" "I have." "Would you share them?" "I would not." Boyd's jaw worked for a moment. He was not a cruel man, only a practical one, and practical men grow impatient with things they cannot fit into a ledger. He touched the brim of his hat with less courtesy than he had arrived with, and rode away without another word. Behind him, one of his hands spat into the snow. That night, when Susan carried out the pail, she stood at the fence longer than usual. The wind moved through the pines and made a sound like a slow river. Somewhere up on the ridge, a wolf answered another wolf, and then a third joined them, and the sound stitched itself across the darkness above the ranch like a thread pulled tight. Susan closed her eyes for a moment. Then she turned back toward the cabin and the yellow square of window where Micah waited. The first heavy snow of the season fell during the 3rd week of December. It came down quietly through a night without wind, and by the time Micah opened the cabin door in the morning, the pasture had been erased. Only the tops of the fence posts showed above the drifts, and the barn seemed to sit lower against the ground as though it had settled during the night. Susan was already up. The stove was already burning. A pot of coffee sat on the back of the range, and a lantern hung ready by the door. They spent the morning breaking a path to the barn and knocking snow off the roof of the chicken coop. The cattle, 23 head of them, had been brought down from the upper pasture 2 weeks earlier and were now sheltering in the lee of the timber where Daniel had built the winter windbreak years back. Susan counted them from the fence, moving her lips silently. She counted them twice. Then she nodded once, to herself, and turned back toward the house. That afternoon, a rider came up from the south end of the valley. It was Levi Ashcroft, a young deputy who worked under Sheriff Cutler and who had, once or twice, brought letters up to the Holloway place when the roads were open. He dismounted at the porch and pulled off his glove before knocking, which was a small courtesy Susan noticed. She invited him inside for coffee, and he accepted, though he stayed standing near the door with his hat in his hand. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, "the sheriff sent me to talk to the outlying places. There's been trouble down near Corvallis. 2 ranches hit in the last 3 weeks. Cattle driven off in the night, cellars broken into. A man over on the Ravalli side got beaten pretty bad when he came out to see what the noise was. Word is, whoever's doing it is working the outlying homesteads first, before the snow closes the passes." Susan set her cup down slowly. "Which homesteads?" "The ones with a widow on them, ma'am, or an old man alone. That's the pattern the sheriff sees." The room was quiet for a long moment. The stove clicked. Micah, sitting at the table with a book he had not been reading, looked up. "How many men?" Susan asked. 4, maybe 5, from the tracks we've read. "Well mounted. They know the country." Sheriff thinks they'll try to clear out before the deep snow sets in and the passes close. He wants everyone warned. Susan thanked him and asked if he needed anything for the ride back, and Levi said he did not, and then he lingered a moment before putting his hat on. He was young enough that his uncertainty showed on his face. "Ma'am," he said, "if you have kin who could come stay a spell, this might be the time. Your place is set apart, and the ridge behind you," he trailed off. Even a deputy from the south end of the valley had heard the talk. "The ridge behind me is what it is," Susan said. "But I thank you for the concern." He tipped his hat and rode out. Susan stood at the window watching him go until the horse and rider were only a smudge against the whiteness. Micah waited. He knew better than to speak first when his aunt was thinking. Finally, she turned. "Micah, I want you to know where the second rifle is." "I know where it is. I want you to know how to load it, not just where it is." "Uncle Daniel showed me 2 years ago. Show me you remember." He got up from the table without a word and went to the corner where the Winchester leaned against the wall behind the coats. Susan watched him work the lever and check the chamber, and something in her face eased, just a little, though her eyes stayed on the window and the ridge beyond it. The days after Levi's visit had a different weight to them. Nothing in the routine changed. The stove was fed the same way. The cattle were checked at the same hours. The evening pail still went out to the fence at dusk. But Susan slept lighter now, and Micah could hear her sometimes in the small hours, walking barefoot across the floorboards to the north window and standing there for a long while before returning to bed. He never asked what she was looking for. He thought he knew. Word from the south end of the valley kept coming, carried up by teamsters and by the mail rider who ran the line as long as the pass stayed open. Another ranch had been hit near Stevensville. A widower named McKay had been found tied to a chair in his own kitchen, his cellar cleaned out, his best 2 mares gone. He had lived. Others, the mail rider said, had been luckier only in that they had heard the riders coming and hidden themselves. The pattern the sheriff had seen was holding. Isolated places, widows and old men, never a spread with a full crew of hands. At the trading post, the conversation turned. It was not that people stopped talking about the Wolf Widow. It was that they now talked about her in 2 different ways at once. In one breath, Elias Boyd would say she was a fool who had brought predators down on the valley. In the next, someone would remark that her place was exposed, and that a woman alone with a boy on that stretch of country was in more danger than most, and the room would go quiet for a moment before another subject was found. Old Tobias Kane, who did not often join these conversations, spoke up on the afternoon of December 21st. He was sitting near the stove with a cup of black coffee cooling in his hand, and he had listened for the better part of an hour without a word. Then he set the cup down on the barrel head beside him and cleared his throat, and the room quieted the way it did when Tobias spoke. "You boys," he said, "keep talking about that pack like it's a plague. Let me tell you something about wolves. A pack that's been in a place long enough to know it, really know it, every draw and every deer trail, that pack don't leave. It patrols. It don't want strangers up there any more than you want strangers in your barn." Elias Boyd started to answer, but Tobias raised one gnarled finger and Boyd stopped. "I'm not saying she's right. I'm saying I've watched that ridge for 6 years now. In 6 years, I have not seen a single track from an outside pack cross that ground. Not one. Whatever else is true, that ridge is spoken for. And a ridge that's spoken for is a ridge that stays quiet." He picked up his coffee and drank the rest of it in one swallow, and that was all he said. But the men in the room turned it over afterward, some of them privately, some of them out loud. Ike Wembley, the trapper, chewed his lip and said nothing. Up at the Holloway place, Susan did not hear any of this. She was in the barn that afternoon, checking the harness on the sledge and tightening a strap that had been giving her worry. Micah was at the woodpile, splitting kindling for the week. The sky above the valley had the milky look that promised more snow before the day was out. When Susan came out of the barn, she stopped for a moment and looked north. "There's weather coming," she said. Micah nodded and kept splitting. He did not need to be told. Even a boy from town, which he had been until a year and a half back, learned to read the sky in country like this. The weather Susan had read in the sky arrived on the evening of December 23rd. It was not a blizzard, only a steady, quiet snowfall that lasted through the night and into the following morning, laying down another 8 inches over what was already on the ground. When it stopped, the valley was hushed in the particular way heavy snow makes country hushed, as though sound itself had been muffled with wool. Christmas Eve dawned clear and bitter, with a sun that gave light but no warmth, and by evening the temperature had dropped so far that the nails in the cabin walls made small ticking noises as they contracted in the cold. Susan and Micah spent Christmas Day quietly. She had baked a pan of cornbread the night before and stewed a hen that had stopped laying that autumn, and they ate together at the table by the light of 2 candles she had saved for the occasion. Afterward, she brought down a wooden box from the shelf above the bed and set it in front of Micah. Inside was a pocket knife with a bone handle, worn smooth along one side. "Daniel's knife. He'd want you to have it," she said. "You're old enough now." Micah held it carefully, turning it in his hands. He did not know what to say. Susan did not seem to require anything. She poured herself another cup of coffee and sat looking at the stove for a long while, and Micah understood, in the wordless way children sometimes understand these things, that his aunt was a long way off in her thoughts, somewhere in a winter that had happened before he was born. The moon that night was 3 days from new. What little of it remained rose late and thin, and by the small hours of the morning, when it should have been highest, it had already slipped behind the western ridge. The valley lay under a darkness so complete that a man standing in the pasture would not have seen his own hand at arm's length. Only the snow itself gave off any light, a faint bluish pallor that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was in that darkness, sometime past 2 in the morning of December 26th, that the men came. There were 5 of them. They had ridden up from the south along the creek bottom, keeping to the willows in the shadow of the cut bank, where their tracks would be hardest to see. They had scouted the Holloway place 2 days earlier from a distance and made their plan. A widow and a boy, 23 head of cattle in a windbreak pen, a single cabin with 2 windows facing the pasture. The men had done this work 5 times already that winter and knew their business. The one who led them, a lean, hard-jawed man who went by the name of Rennick, had ridden with a bad outfit down in the Powder River country before the winter of '86 broke it apart, and he had brought some of the old lessons north with him. The plan was simple. 2 men would go around behind the barn and cut the wire on the windbreak pen. 2 more would move the cattle out quietly along the creek, back the way they had come. Rennick himself would watch the cabin with a rifle. If the widow came to the door, he would put a shot through it high enough to warn, but low enough to persuade. If she still came out, he would put the second shot lower. He did not particularly want to kill her. He had done it before when it was necessary, and he would do it again if it came to that. But a killing brought more law than a theft did, and Rennick preferred his work quiet. The 5 men crossed the last of the open country and reached the base of the ridge just after 2:30. That was when their plan began to come apart. The base of the ridge, where the pasture ended and the timber began, was the last stretch of ground the raiders had to cross before they reached the barn. Rennick had studied it from a rise 2 days before and judged it manageable. 100 yards of open snow, then the darker line of the lodgepoles. Then the barn itself only another 60 yards beyond. What he had not judged, because he could not have known to judge it, was what lay under the timber. Not the trees themselves. The territory. The pack that lived on the ridge behind the Holloway Ranch had held that ground for 6 winters. 2 adult wolves had come first, in the autumn after Daniel Holloway died. Drifting down from the high country because a fire the year before had pushed the elk lower and the wolves had followed. They had denned in a rockfall a mile up the north slope and raised a litter the following spring. The pack now numbered 7. They knew every draw and every game trail. They knew the smell of the widow and of the boy and of the cattle that came and went along the fence line. And they knew these smells the way a man knows the shape of his own kitchen in the dark. They did not consider these smells threats. They were part of the country. The smell of 5 strange men on 5 strange horses coming up through the willows at 2:30 in the morning was not part of the country. The lead wolf, a heavy-shouldered gray male in his prime, caught the scent first. He was bedded on a rock outcrop that gave him a view of the whole southern approach, and he had been half asleep when the wind shifted and brought him what he needed to know. He was on his feet before the men had crossed 40 yards of open ground. He did not run down to challenge them. Wolves do not, generally, challenge armed men. What he did was what the pack had done for 6 winters when any strange scent came into their country, he announced. The first howl broke the silence of the valley from a point about 200 yards above and to the east of where the raiders were riding. It was a long, low sound that climbed slowly to a note that seemed to hold itself in the air even after the wolf had stopped. A second wolf answered from further west, a higher voice, thinner, then a third from up near the rockfall, and a fourth almost at once, and within perhaps 20 seconds the whole ridge above the raiders was speaking. Not one call, not two. A living wall of sound stitched across the darkness above them, coming from every direction at once, so that a man on horseback at the foot of that ridge could not have told you whether the pack was 10 wolves or 30. The horses knew. Rennick's mount was the first to break. She was a good mare who had done this work before, but she had come out of Wyoming country where the wolves had been trapped and poisoned out a decade earlier. And the sound coming down off that ridge was not a sound her body had a memory for. She threw her head, sidestepped hard, and when Rennick tried to hold her, she reared and came down running. The second horse followed within a heartbeat. The third bolted sideways into the willows, and its rider went off the back into the snow. The fourth and fifth wheeled together and tried to go back the way they had come, and one of them caught a foreleg in a hidden badger hole and went down screaming, and its rider was pinned beneath it for the crucial half-minute during which everything else came apart. Inside the cabin, Susan Holloway sat up in bed with her eyes already open. She had been awake for some time. She had heard the first howl before it was a howl, in the way a woman hears a floorboard settle in a house she has lived in for 20 years. Susan was out of bed and pulling her coat over her nightdress before the third wolf had answered. She moved without hurry and without waste. 6 winters of living alone on that ranch had taught her that panic used up the same minutes that clear thought needed, and she had no minutes to spare. She woke Micah with one hand on his shoulder and one finger to her lips, and the boy sat up already understanding, the way he had understood many things that Autumn, without needing them, explained. The second rifle, she said quietly. You stay by the north window. You do not fire unless someone comes through the door. You do not fire toward the barn. Do you hear me? I hear you. Say it back. Not unless they come through the door. Not toward the barn. She nodded once and took her own rifle down from the pegs above the mantel. It was Daniel's old Winchester, the one he had carried for 15 years before he did not come home, and she had cleaned and oiled it every month since. She checked the magazine by touch. Full, she took the lantern from the hook by the door, but did not light it yet. Then she lifted the latch and stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit her like a hand laid flat against her chest, but she did not feel it in any way that mattered. The pasture stretched away in front of her, faintly blue under the snowlight, and beyond it, the ridge rose black against a sky pricked with stars. The howling was already thinning. The pack had said what it had to say. What she heard instead was the sound she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting for it. A horse screaming somewhere near the creek, a man shouting, another man cursing him to be quiet, the dry percussion of hooves finding no purchase in deep snow and going down. Susan lit the lantern. She did it deliberately, with her back to the pasture, so that her eyes would not be blinded by the flare. Then she turned and held the lantern high above her head at arm's length, off to her right side, well away from her body. Any man out there with a rifle, and the presence of mind to use it, would aim at the light. The light was 3 feet from where she stood. You are on my ground, she called out. Her voice carried across the pasture without shaking. You will lay your weapons in the snow, and you will stand where I can see you. If you run, my rifle will find you before the drifts do. If you fire, you will not fire twice. Somewhere near the willows, a man answered with a shot. It was a wild shot, fired by a man who could not see and whose horse was gone from under him. The bullet went high and wide and struck the eave of the barn behind her with a splintering sound. Susan did not flinch. She lowered the lantern to the porch rail, sighted along Daniel's Winchester in the direction the muzzle flash had come from, and fired once into the ground 3 feet in front of where she judged the man to be lying. The snow fountained up. The man screamed as though he had been hit, though he had not been. The scream told her exactly where he was. "The next one is not in the snow," she said. "Stand up. Hands where I can see them. Walk toward the light." There was a long moment during which nothing happened. Then, slowly, a dark shape rose out of the drift at the edge of the willows and began wading toward the cabin with its arms held high. Somewhere further along the creek, another voice was calling out that his leg was broken and asking, in a tone Susan had never expected to hear from a man come to rob her, for someone to please, for God's sake, help him. Susan did not lower the rifle. She kept the lantern where it was, kept her body where it was, and let the man come to her across the pasture, with his arms up and his boots breaking through the crust with every step. When he was 30 feet from the porch, she told him to stop, and he stopped. When she told him to lie face down in the snow, he did that too, without argument. Though the cold of the drift must have gone through his coat like a knife. "How many with you?" "4, he said into the snow. His voice was thick. "1 down by the creek with a horse on him. 1 somewhere in the willows. 2 run off after the horses." "Names, ma'am, names." He gave them. Susan committed them to memory the way she committed feed prices and calving dates, which is to say completely and without effort. Then she called out toward the willows in the same steady voice, and after a long silence a second man answered from perhaps 40 yards off, saying he was unarmed and asking permission to come in. She gave it. He came the same way the first one had, hands high, and she put him face down in the snow 3 paces from his companion. The one pinned beneath the horse she could hear clearly now. He was not shouting anymore. He was crying, in the low, exhausted way men cry when they have been in pain long enough to lose their pride about it. Susan considered him for a moment. Then she raised her voice and called back toward the cabin without turning her head. "Micah, bring the coil of rope from the barn peg. Bring it slow. Stay behind me." "Yes, ma'am." The boy came out with the rope and did exactly as he was told. Susan tied the 2 men in the snow herself, wrists behind them, quickly and well, the way Daniel had shown her to tie a calf for branding years ago. She left them face down and told Micah to fetch 2 horse blankets from the barn and lay them over the men so they would not freeze while she saw to the third. Micah did it without a word. He was moving in that careful, deliberate way children move when they have understood, mid-crisis, that they are being trusted with a piece of adult work and must not drop it. The man pinned by the creek was named Otis Warren, though Susan would not learn that until later. His horse was dead. Its neck had broken in the fall. His right leg was bent under the animal's shoulder at a wrong angle, and he had been lying in the snow for perhaps 20 minutes, and the cold had done him a mercy by dulling most of the pain. When Susan came up to him with the lantern, he opened his eyes and looked at her and did not try to lie about anything. "Ma'am," he said, "I would take it kindly if you would shoot my horse in the head. She is not dead yet, and I cannot bear it." Susan looked. The mare's eye was still open, still moving. Susan did what he asked. 1 shot, close and clean, and the eye stopped moving. Then she set the rifle down within her own reach but out of his, and she and Micah worked for the better part of a quarter hour with a lever and a length of barn timber to lift the carcass just enough to drag him free. He fainted once during it. When he came to, she had already splinted the leg with 2 lengths of kindling and a strip torn from her own petticoat, and she was buttoning her coat back around him. "Why?" he said. His teeth were chattering hard now. "Why would you?" "Because you asked me to shoot your horse," Susan said, And a man who thinks of his horse first is a man who can be spoken to later. Dawn came slow and gray over the Bitterroot. By the time the first real light reached the pasture, Susan had all three men in the barn, tied and blanketed and out of the wind, and Micah was on the road south riding the mare that Rennick had abandoned in the willows. The horse had turned up an hour before dawn, standing at the pasture fence with her reins trailing, looking for company. Susan had put the boy on her with strict instructions to ride to the trading post, find the deputy or anyone with a working horse, and bring back help. She had watched him go until the shape of him disappeared into the pale country to the south. Then she had gone back into the barn and stood a long while beside the man with the broken leg, not speaking, just present, the way a person is present at a bedside. Levi Ashcroft rode up to the Holloway place at 10:30 in the morning with Sheriff Cutler and 4 other men behind him. Micah was with them, wrapped in a borrowed coat too large for him, riding double behind the deputy. They had made good time. When they came into the yard, Susan was on the porch with the Winchester across her knees and a cup of coffee going cold in her hand. And she stood up as they dismounted and told the sheriff, in the same flat voice she had used all night, exactly what had happened and where the men were. Cutler was a careful man. He listened without interrupting, then went into the barn with 2 of his deputies and came out 10 minutes later with a look on his face that Susan could not entirely read. He walked over to the porch and stood a moment before he spoke. "Ma'am," he said, "the one who called himself Rennick down there, his real name is Silas Ober. There's paper on him out of 3 counties. Cattle theft, assault. 1 killing they can prove, and 2 they suspect. The other 2 you have tied up are the Warren brothers. They have been working with him since the fall. Every ranch that has been hit between here and Corvallis this winter, these men hit it." Susan nodded. She did not seem surprised or particularly pleased. She only nodded the way a woman nods when a piece of arithmetic she has done in her head is confirmed by someone with pen and paper. "There was a 5th, she said. "He ran with the horses. I do not know how far he got." "We will find him," Cutler said, and he sounded certain of it, and he was right. Though it would take until the following afternoon, and the man would be found half frozen in a line shack 6 miles south, offering to confess to anything if only someone would give him a warm drink. The sheriff took off his hat then and turned it in his hands for a moment before putting it back on. It was the gesture of a man readjusting something inside himself. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, "I owe you an apology, not for anything I have said, for things I have not said when others were saying them, and I was in the room. You do not owe me anything, Sheriff. I believe I do. But we can leave it for another day." By noon, the prisoners had been loaded onto a sledge and taken south under guard. The dead horse had been dragged clear of the creek. Micah was inside the cabin, eating a bowl of stew standing up because he was too tired to sit and too hungry to wait, and Susan was in the yard alone, looking up toward the ridge. The pack had gone quiet again hours ago. She could not see them and did not expect to. But she stood there a long moment anyway, with her hand resting on the top rail of the fence. And her lips moved once in a way that no one saw. The story of the raid on the Holloway place traveled through the Bitterroot faster than any story had traveled through it in years. By New Year's Day, it had reached Missoula. By the second week of January, it had reached as far south as Hamilton and as far north as the mill camps above Lolo. The details shifted, as details do when a story moves from mouth to mouth. In some tellings, Susan had held off 10 men. In others, the pack had come down out of the timber and torn the raiders apart. Neither was true. What was true was strange enough on its own and needed no help. Elias Boyd rode up to the Holloway place on the 6th of January. He did it alone, which mattered, and he did it in daylight, which also mattered. He dismounted at the gate and took off his hat before he was halfway up the walk. Susan met him on the porch. She did not invite him inside, and he did not seem to expect it. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, "I was wrong about the ridge. I was wrong about you. I am sorry for both." Susan looked at him a long moment. Then she nodded once and stepped back and opened the door, and he went in and had coffee at her table. and they spoke for the better part of an hour about the things neighbors speak about when they have decided to be neighbors again. It was on the 12th of January, at the Trading Post, that Susan finally answered the question the valley had been asking for 4 months. She had come down for flour and coffee and lamp oil, and old Tobias Kane was there by the stove as he always was, and Ike Wembley was there, and 2 or 3 other men, and the talk had turned, as it kept turning that winter, to the pack on the ridge. Someone asked her, gently and without malice, why she had begun the feeding in the first place. Susan set her parcels down on the counter. She was quiet for a while. Then she spoke, and the men in the room went still, because she did not usually speak of such things, and they knew it. When Daniel did not come home from the storm in '83, she said, the search went on for 4 days. On the 4th day, one of the men from the search party, it was Harlan Pratt. Some of you remember him. Harlan came upon a wolf's tracks in a draw 6 miles above the north pasture. He was a hunter, and he followed them. Because a wolf in that country in that season had to be feeding on something, and he wanted to know what. The tracks took him to my husband. Daniel was under the snow in a place no man would have thought to look. The wolf had not touched him. It had only passed by. But if Harlan had not followed those tracks, we would not have found Daniel until the spring thaw. And by then there would have been nothing left to bring home. There would have been no grave to visit. There would have been no place to go. She stopped and looked at the counter and then looked up again. I have been paying a debt, she said. That is all. No one spoke for a while. Then Tobias Kane, from his chair by the stove, said quietly, that is a debt worth paying, ma'am. And no one disagreed. That spring, without any meeting being called and without any paper being signed, the county's hunting map was quietly redrawn. The ridge behind the Holloway Ranch was left off it. Trappers worked the country to the east and the country to the west, but not the ground above Susan's fence. The pack remained. It never grew large, and it never troubled the valley stock. And every evening, until the last winter of Susan Holloway's life 11 years later, a covered tin pail went out to the fence at dusk, and a woman stood a moment looking up at the timber and then turned back toward the yellow square of her window. If this story stayed with you, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who loves frontier tales of quiet courage, and leave a comment telling us what you would have done in Susan's place. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of the men and women who built their lives on the edge of the wild country, and hit the bell so you never miss the next one. Until then, keep a lantern in the window and a kind hand at the fence.